August 15th, 1947. A date that changed the destiny of over 400 million people. But what if that day never came? What if the British flag still flew over Delhi today? What if India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh was still painted red on the world map? As part of the British Empire, in this video we're diving into one of history's most fascinating alternate realities. We'll explore the political landscape, the economic impact, and the cultural shifts that would have defined a subcontinent under continuous British rule. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll see the modern world in a completely different light. Let's explore what the world would look like if the British never left India. It's a journey that might surprise you. Have you ever wondered what the world would look like if the British Empire never fell? To understand this alternate timeline, we need to go back to 1945. In our world, World War II absolutely devastated Britain's economy. The empire was already crumbling. Independence movements were exploding across Asia and Africa, and Britain simply couldn't afford to hold on to its colonies anymore. But what if things had gone differently? What if, somehow, Britain had emerged from the war economically stronger? Or what if those independence movements were brutally crushed in the 1940s? Perhaps American pressure on Britain to decolonize never even materialized. Let's imagine one of these scenarios happened. The year is 1947. Instead of granting independence to India, Britain decides to restructure the Indian Empire. They create a new dominion, something like Canada or Australia, but with a crucial difference: far less autonomy. This single decision would completely reshape the entire 20th century. The immediate consequences would be catastrophic. The leaders of the independence movement, Nehru, Gandhi's followers, Ginand, the millions of Indians who had fought and bled for freedom would never accept this quietly. What we'd likely see is a massive, prolonged armed resistance. Think of something between Algeria's brutal war of independence and Vietnam's long, drawn-out struggle, but potentially even bloodier, given India's sheer size and population. This new British-controlled India would become a powder keg. The British Army would be locked in a guerrilla war across the subcontinent, fighting in the cities, the jungles, and the mountains. The cost in lives and resources would be staggering, not just for India, but for Britain as well. Young British soldiers would be sent to fight a war their own country could barely sustain, creating deep divisions back home. And what about the rest of the world? The Cold War is just beginning. How would the Soviet Union and the United States react to this giant, bleeding wound in Asia? The Soviets would almost certainly support the Indian resistance fighters, sending weapons and advisors to destabilize their old imperial rival. The United States would be in a difficult position, torn between supporting its ally, Britain, and its own anti-colonial principles. This could create a major rift in the Western alliance. This conflict wouldn't just stay in India. The fire of rebellion would likely spread to Britain's other colonies in Africa and Southeast Asia, who would see the Indian struggle as their own. The British Empire, instead of a managed decline, would be consumed by dozens of violent conflicts across the globe. The world map, as we know it, would be completely redrawn. Have you ever wondered what would have happened if India didn't gain its independence in 19... It's a huge what-if that completely changes the course of modern history. Let's dive into this alternate timeline. First, without independence, the partition of India and Pakistan as we know it wouldn't have happened. This means one very crucial thing: the horrific communal violence of partition, which tragically took over 1 million lives, might have been delayed. But let's be clear, the underlying tensions between communities wouldn't just vanish. Instead, you'd likely see a united resistance front, at least for a while. Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, all fighting together against a common enemy: British colonial rule. Imagine thousands of veterans from the Indian National Army, battle-hardened and experienced, forming the core of a massive guerrilla movement. They wouldn't just be protesting, they would be actively fighting for freedom across the subcontinent. Britain's response would be swift and brutal. Think about what the British did in Kenya during the Momo uprising, but amplify that on an unimaginable scale. We're talking about massive detention camps, collective punishment for entire villages, and intense counterinsurgency operations in every major city, from Karachi to Calcutta. It would be a full-blown war for control. This military occupation would come at a staggering cost to Britain. To control a subcontinent of 400 million people, they'd need to maintain an army of possibly 500,000 troops. They'd implement sophisticated surveillance systems and run a brutal police state, even while exploiting India's vast resources. This effort would bleed the already struggling post-war British economy completely dry. Now, here's where the global picture gets really interesting. The two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, would definitely see an opportunity. The Americans, wanting to project their anti-colonial image, might start covertly funding some of the more moderate resistance movements. Meanwhile, the Soviets would almost certainly pour weapons, money, and training into communist-led factions within the resistance. Suddenly, India isn't just fighting a war for independence. It becomes another hot battleground in the Cold War. The fight for freedom would get tangled up in a global ideological struggle, with Indian soil becoming the stage for a proxy war between capitalism and communism. The path to freedom would be longer, bloodier, and far more complicated, forever altering. Let's zoom out and see what this would mean for the whole world. Without an independent India, the entire decolonization movement would stall. Think about it. If Britain, the world's largest empire, could hold on to its crown jewel, India, what message does that send? Why would France give up Algeria? Why should the Dutch ever leave Indonesia? The 1950s and 60s, which in our timeline were filled with new flags and anthems, would see far fewer independent nations. The United Nations would look completely different. A club dominated by colonial powers, with Asian and African voices largely silenced. The non-aligned movement, which India was so crucial in leading, giving a third option in the Cold War. It might never have even formed. But here's the great paradox. Britain itself would be a declining superpower, desperately and expensively clinging to a vast empire it could no longer afford. Imagine the British economy in the 1950s. It's trying to build a welfare state at home, a national health service for its people. But at the same time, it's spending billions to suppress rebellions across Asia and Africa. It's simply unsustainable. Sooner or later, something would have to give. Britain would be stretched to the breaking point, a shadow of its former self, bankrupted by its own imperial pride. Now, what about development inside India? Some people argue that British rule brought benefits like railroads and institutions. And while that's true to an extent, by the 1950s, those systems were designed for one thing: extraction. British policies had already systematically impoverished what was once one of the world's richest regions. Without independence, India wouldn't experience the green revolution that fed millions, or the rise of the world-class Indian institutes of technology, or the economic boom of the 1990s. Instead, you'd see an economy permanently designed to serve Britain. Indian raw materials like cotton and jute would be shipped to British factories, while Indian markets would be flooded with British-made goods, crushing local industry. Indian talent, the brilliant minds that built modern India, would be serving the empire rather than building their own nation. And the human cost? It's almost too grim to imagine. Famines under British rule were devastating, killing millions of people. The Bengal famine of 1943 alone, just 4 years before independence, killed an estimated 3 million people, without an independent Indian government accountable to its own citizens. Who's to say tragedies like this wouldn't have repeated themselves throughout the 50s, 60s, and beyond? The lack of self-determination would mean a continued story of exploitation and preventable suffering. It's a chilling reminder of how much changed on that day. What if Britain had refused to leave India in 1947? It's a fascinating question. But the truth is, Britain couldn't have held on forever. History tells us that empires inevitably fall, especially when the colonized outnumber the colonizers by a staggering 400 to 1. Even if Britain had somehow managed to suppress the independence movement, their rule would have ended eventually, probably in a much uglier way. Let's imagine Britain tries to cling to power until the 1960s, or even the 1970s. Sooner or later, one of a few scenarios would play out. Scenario 1 is what I call the Vietnam effect. Think about France and Algeria or America and Vietnam. The British public, seeing the brutality of the occupation broadcast on their televisions every night, would turn against the war. The images of violence would spark massive protests in London, Manchester, and Liverpool. The moral and political cost would become too high, and the government would be forced to withdraw. India would still gain its independence, but only after another 20 or 30 years of brutal conflict, suffering, and resistance. The human cost would be immense. Scenario 2 is total economic collapse. Maintaining a massive military occupation halfway across the world is incredibly expensive. The cost of holding India would eventually bankrupt Britain completely. Imagine the welfare state collapsing, the pound crashing to worthless levels. Britain would be forced to abandon India not out of a moral awakening, but simply to survive as a nation. It would be a desperate, chaotic retreat, leaving a power vacuum behind. Scenario 3 is overwhelming international pressure. The post-war world was changing. The United Nations, led by both the United States and the Soviet Union for their own strategic reasons, would condemn Britain's actions. Sanctions would be imposed. Britain would become an international pariah, the last stubborn colonial empire in a world that had moved on. Isolated and shamed, they would have no choice but to But here's the most important and tragic part of this alternate history. No matter how or when independence finally came, India would be in a far, far worse state. Decades more of resistance warfare would have utterly destroyed its infrastructure, railways, roads, cities. Millions more people would have died, not just from direct conflict, but from the famines and diseases that always accompany prolonged war. The psychological trauma would be generational. And what about the religious tensions that were already simmering? Under a prolonged, repressive British rule, they would only fester and grow. When the British finally left, those tensions would explode with even more violence than they did in 1947. Instead of a partition into two nations, we might have seen a complete fragmentation of the subcontinent into several smaller, warring states, divided along religious and ethnic lines. So, while the end of British rule was complex and painful, the alternative of them staying longer would have been a catastrophe on an even greater scale. Ever wondered what the world would look like if India's struggle for independence had failed? Let's dive into that alternate timeline. Picture this. Britain, obsessed with holding on to its empire, becomes an international pariah. Its economy crumbles under the strain, and it likely never joins the European Union, remaining isolated in the shadow of its former self. What about India? It eventually gains independence, but much later, maybe in the 70s or 80s, the heroes of the resistance become its leaders, but they inherit a nation shattered by decades of prolonged conflict. India's incredible rise as a tech and economic powerhouse is delayed by decades. Nations like Pakistan and Bangladesh might never have been formed, or the map could look completely different. Globally, the consequences are huge. The global south has fewer independent voices. China's influence in Asia could be even stronger without a powerful India to provide balance. The Cold War would have been a different game entirely, with fewer neutral countries. It's a darker, more polarized world, with far fewer inspiring. What if Britain never left India? The answer might surprise you. They would have left eventually, but not before causing unimaginable suffering, delaying progress across the entire global south, and tanking their own economy in the process. See, decolonization wasn't some generous gift from Britain. It was inevitable. The only real question was how much blood would be spilled before it happened. India's independence in 1947, despite the horrific tragedy of partition, was a massive victory for human dignity and the right to An alternate timeline where Britain held on longer shows us just how much worse things could have been.